Hi class, welcome to week 6. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking in this video. I just want to go over a couple of key insights from the material because I love the readings for this week. I think that they provide us with incredible insight into the ways that individuals, families, and communities are impacted by the many different types of isms or experiences of systemic oppression. We might be familiar with some of these, such as racism, classism, heterosexism, sexism, ageism, ableism, etc. These refer to the many ways that people may be marginalized or experience active discrimination because of some particular or multiple aspects of their identity. So why is this important? Our class has been focused on the different levels of assessment and intervention for children and families at risk of different types of harm, whether that harm be internal, such as within the familia, as in the case of Spanglish, in the family, as in the case of child abuse, or whether that harm is from external sources, such as poverty, exposure to community violence, dependence on public systems, etc. While many of us may work in clinical setting, it's imperative that we understand that the clinical is the political and vice versa. We cannot be within clinical situations, particularly with people who are from marginalized communities, and not understand that there are political implications of our work and that people are impacted by political and larger macro systems. This is particularly true for those whose identity is othered in our society in some way. A good definition for what that means will be in the Adames article on the Heart Framework. But the different ways that people's identity is othered in our society might be through societal attitudes, norms, and even through laws and policies. So the reason that this is important is, as comes from the Adames article on the Heart Framework, is that individuals and communities whom experience violence, racism, and ethnic oppression are at risk of experiencing psychological harm, including trauma. This article talks about different ways that people may exhibit trauma symptoms or exhibit psychological distress, specifically because of their experiences with actions, policies, and behaviors in society that are specifically related to systemic oppression because of their identity and place within our society. So this article is specifically relates to Latinx immigrant communities, but I find it very applicable to multiple different communities that have experienced similar things in our society. The article also talks about intersectionality, or the ways in which systems of oppression affect individuals who hold membership in multiple socially constructed groups, and we'll discuss the different ways that laws and policies can help maintain systems of oppression. And we've looked at some of this in examples of child welfare history, or the different ways that we've approached certain groups for protection and also within the systems that aim to help differently depending on race or ethnic makeup. So we know that even within systems that are designed to help families, we've got to be very careful about the different ways that societal attitudes and those isms can kind of creep into those systems and be reinforced by our actions. Oops, wrong. Doing two computers at the same time. I'm not prepared for that. The articles will also discuss that trauma-informed care focuses on building safe spaces to work on individual symptoms of trauma or respond to individual symptoms of trauma. But what I think is very important to consider in the Heart Framework article is that not all communities can find truly safe space, specifically because of the particularities of their situation, or the particularities of the ways in which they're experiencing oppression or discrimination, and the ways that this is politicized into laws and policies to work against them. A lot of you have commented on the different ways that families have reacted to certain child welfare system, the presence of child welfare workers in the past that People have not always felt comfortable approaching CPS, for example, because they're afraid that they're going to have their children taken away, and that some of the innovative approaches and interventions have aimed at trying to reduce that. This demonstrates that same idea that for certain communities, because of history or because of kind of the lived experience of different communities, there may not be a safe space. And so kind of how do we create those safe spaces while acknowledging the vulnerabilities that people still face? And so kind of related to that, related to trauma-informed care, this framework takes it a step further and looks at the combination of trauma-informed care with liberation psychology, which historically focuses on the communal journey of healing and resistance. And so the framework that this article discusses recognizes that people are likely in the nexus, so they're in the connecting point of these two frameworks, but they're impacted individually in unique ways that can't be generalized, and may be particularly individual to that particular situation, their individual resilience, their community support, the ways that they're responding to their own trauma and own experience, and also they're part of a larger social narrative about that group and whatever that is that they define as. So those are kind of important things that many people we're in this middle space, right? We're individually affected by these clinical considerations, and also we're part of this larger story about the ways that the whole social system is revolving and incorporating people into society or excluding them, and that impacts people in particular ways. So the readings that deal with community cohesion, natural support networks, intersectionality, all of these can help us become stronger social workers with more understanding and more ability to think critically about what may be the cause of some psychological symptoms that we see. Right? A lot of times in our work settings, we focus specifically on the psychological symptoms without kind of really looking at the environment to try to figure out what it is that's causing some of this distress. We deal with diagnoses because of billing requirements and all of these different things, but we don't always think about the environmental factors and the different causes that could be resulting in some of these psychological symptoms. And that's kind of the beauty of social work, right? Is that we have this mandate to think about the environmental factors that cause psychological harm, not just the psychological symptoms, but really the whole person and the package and the community that they come from. The CDC article is going to discuss the intersecting forms of violence in many homes and communities, which puts people at risk of more violence and more harm from that violence when those different forms of violence connect and cause kind of a larger kind of cluster of problems for people to navigate through. The Schultz article discusses that traumatic experiences often disconnect people from community spaces intended to heal, and that some healing interventions can also, that we have in what we offer people as interventions, can sometimes interrupt natural support networks within community. So I find this article super interesting for us to consider about the ways that what we propose as healing interventions for some communities may even disrupt the natural supports that could exist in order to heal from violence. And then the articles and information on intimate partner violence, while the material in intimate partner violence may not directly relate to the questions of systemic oppression in an obvious way, I think placing the materials on intimate partner violence that will help us better understand the dynamics of power and control in intimate partner violence situations makes good sense as part of a larger conversation about broader violence against women, girls, and vulnerable populations. In fact, the current work on intersectionality that's referenced in the earlier article from Adames, which continues to evolve questions about intersectionality, originated in work around the rights of women of color in IPV situations and finding space to heal and act communally. So I think that there's a strong connection, particularly around some of the roots of some of these movements, looking at intersectionality and looking at the ways that people are experiencing systemic oppression. So, nope, wrong computer again. Oh my goodness. So what does this mean for us? So I just offer these questions as ways to reflect on the readings this week as you get into them, to kind of frame a little bit of your thinking around what do we do with this information once we have it, right? So how can we recognize the ways that we and our clients are impacted by systems of oppression? Do we recognize that people are affected by actual systems of oppression currently? Are we able to think critically about some of the things that we see and understand about the ways that people react or the ways that people may be impacted? Are we thinking kind of as deeply as possible about how people may be feeling given certain situations that are going on in our communities? How can we be mindful of the ways our institutions and social work practice may perpetuate systems of oppression? This is part of our constant effort to be self-critical about our own practice. How are we demonstrating cultural humility and openness? Humility about the need to continue to learn and to be open to reflecting on our own practice. This is super important as we embark on this work. And related to that, how do we actively create spaces where people will be liberated from oppression? So not just safe spaces where people have a moment to pause, which is also very important, but how do we kind of transform our spaces into places where people feel that they can share their stories and be who they are, and find a way to liberate themselves from the oppression that they seek, that they face? How do we honor and help individuals and families engage in community spaces and natural support networks? How do we help people connect to their own communities when they're isolated, when they're disconnected? How do we help people identify spaces where they can do that to the extent where that's safe and comfortable for them? And then how do we engage in resistance, however we define that, and provide avenues for clients to do the same? How are we aware of what's going on in our communities and in client communities, to bring people together, to work for change, to kind of engage in larger social movements and struggles for liberation and justice in different things? Are we even aware of what those activities are? How do we help clients engage in what seems interesting or relevant to them? These are important things to be aware of, even if you're not directly involved in them, or even if you don't have the time and space to be able to engage in that. How do you participate in at least being aware of ways that people can engage in resistance activities in whatever way they need to? So I offer these as opportunities for reflection as you read this material, and if anybody has any questions or feedback, I'm super happy to have conversations with any of you who want to talk about this material or anything else. If not, have a great week.